Chapter 8. My Encounter with the Singularity Archetype. Now that I've introduced the Singularity Archetype, I'll relate the story of how I first encountered it in the external world. I provide the account not as an autobiographical tangent so much as a case history of what an encounter and ongoing relationship with this archetype looks like. It was a summer afternoon in 1969 or 1970, and I was about 12 or 13 years old. I was sitting in the tiny breakfast room and annexed to the kitchen of my family home in the Bronx, watching our black and white television. A sci-fi film was coming on, a 1960 British movie with an arresting title, Village of the Damned. I'm pretty sure my dad was sitting behind me and that he watched the film as well. Nothing I'd ever seen on television was so mesmerizing. The story and the serious and intelligent tone of the film were magnetic for me. Although I didn't share this with my dad or with anyone, the film left me stunned and shaken. It was a life-changing encounter, and the experience had a religious intensity. I felt as though the film had come from inside of me. The core of my being began to vibrate, and I knew that something of the greatest significance had occurred. Nothing that I had ever seen or heard before in the outer world struck certain of the deepest and most hidden parts of my being, as this film had. I felt the stir of destiny like a field of crackling electricity all around me. How did they know? Where had this film come from? Village of the Damned was my first encounter with a full-blown expression of the Singularity archetype in the outer world as an artifact of contemporary culture. It was also expressed in one of the most potent carriers of mythology ever created, the movie. A few months ago, at least when this was written in the summer of 2010, all across the globe there were many other 12-year-olds having a similar experience of religious intensity watching the movie Avatar. The same year that I had this experience with the Village of the Damned, I came to a life-changing revelation about a nearly fatal paranormal experience which had occurred when I was 10. The revelation had spiritual dimensions and filled me with a sense of the profound meaningfulness and high stakes of life. And you can read about this paranormal experience in A Mutant Nexus. There's a subtitle as well. You can find that on zaporacle.com. When I was 14, I had a second encounter with the Singularity archetype, expressed in another potent mythological form. This time the medium was a science fiction novel, Arthur C. Clarke's masterpiece, Childhood's End. I carried my battered paperback copy of Childhood's End through the halls of the Bronx High School of Science, and it became a ball of light glowing in my hands. Besides the content, what was most disturbing was that somehow what I thought were my most creative and original science fiction ideas that I expected to write about one day, had somehow shown up in this tattered paperback. I flipped back to the copyright page, 1953. This book was written 4 years before I was born. How could such a thing be possible? This was probably also the year I encountered Clarke's other masterpiece, 2001, his visionary collaboration with Stanley Kubrick that brought the Singularity archetype to the big screen with cutting-edge industrial light and magic special effects. Though the film was released in 1968, I probably saw it as a revival in 1971. Dostoevsky and the Voice from the Clock Radio. Another key anomaly occurred during my 14th year, though it will not be clear until later how it is directly related to the Singularity archetype. And if you hear any howling wind in the background, I've purposely left the window open to see if that'll record, because I think it'd be a cool effect to have in the background. I felt something prod me out of the deep sleep of a healthy 14-year-old at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Some irresistible inner prompting had me reaching toward my futuristic-looking Panasonic clock radio to switch on the sound. When I did so, I heard a voice coming out of the radio that sounded exactly like my own mind speaking in my head. I was stunned and wondered if I was still dreaming. But everything in the room felt so physical and real. The voice seemed to express my innermost thoughts, the thoughts I had not shared with anyone, and the thoughts and feelings expressed by the voice had what I thought were the unique perspective of my own mind and personality. Suddenly there was a station identification break, and I found out what was going on. It was WBAI-FM, the station I tuned into far more than any other. The WBAI of the 60s and 70s was unlike any radio station that has ever existed before or since. Referred to in a New York Times Magazine piece as an anarchist circus, one station manager was jailed in protest, and the staff, in protest at sweeping proposed changes of another station manager, seized the studio facilities, then located in a deconsecrated church, as well as the transmitter located atop the Empire State Building. Turning into WBAI at random, I could find almost anything going on, and some of it was mind-blowing. For example, there was a popular show run by hilariously militant lesbians. Males were not even permitted to call the show, but they did anyway, and always to tell the militants how much they loved and supported them. In return, the lesbians showered them with verbal abuse. "Well, don't you worry your pretty little head about it," they would say as they hung up on the male callers. As we'll see with this and many other examples, a source of cultural novelty is also likely to be a source for strange, sometimes synchronistic encounters with the singularity archetype. Some of the stranger radio shows of that era of New York City played an almost internet-like role in informing me about esoteric subjects. The most significant of these was the famous Long John Nebel all-night radio show, a magnet for all subjects paranormal, and the forerunner of the Coast to Coast AM franchise. I pulled many all-nighters during my high school years, experimenting with photography in our basement darkroom while listening to reports of the bizarre and anomalous on the radio. After the WBAI station identification break, I found out what seemed like telepathic radio was actually an all-night live reading from Dostoevsky's haunting novella, Notes from Underground. When I was 19 and a junior in college, I had the first chance of my academic career to do some independent research. I'd always meant to find out who this Dostoevsky was and how he seemed to be able to write in a way that uncannily evoked the inner contents of my mind. As with other encounters, Dostoevsky novels were cases of the supposed firewall that exists between inner and outer, blurring out into a wide-open portal. Thinking about the psychology of Dostoevsky characters while sitting on a bench at night in a quiet part of the college campus, I crossed a developmental event horizon and experienced the beginning of my adult consciousness. It was such a decisive change that memories before and after that moment have a decidedly different quality, as my fundamental level of self-awareness transformed. The threshold occurred as a cascade of insights that revealed a psychological model and type that characterized myself and many of Dostoevsky's key characters. I called this type the profound egocentric, but had no idea how it connected to my other obsessions related to the singularity archetype. Having successfully, I thought, penetrated the Dostoevsky anomaly the year before, in the last semester of my senior year at college, I set out to understand the strange, uncanny significance I sensed in Village of the Damned and Childhood's End. And by the way, the resulting paper of the radio anomaly, Dostoevsky and the Profound Egocentric, it can be found at zaporacle.com. Encounter with Jung. Unlikely help offered itself to me during the course of my studies. The chairman of the philosophy department, though I was an English major, had become my benefactor and opened doors for me in a highly conservative academic environment, allowing me to pursue interdisciplinary research projects into obscure, shadowy areas. But it was actually my mom, a psychologist whose career spanned 44 years, who provided the crucial suggestion that I read what a Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung had to say about the archetypes and the collective unconscious. I looked him up in the encyclopedia and wondered what this dead Swiss guy, who was born in the 19th century and was the son of a minister, could possibly tell me, a Jewish kid from the Bronx, about my obsession with certain works of science fiction. And so I came to stand before the many elegant black volumes of the Princeton Bollingen edition of Jung's collected works. I scanned the index volume for a few minutes and came across a late work, Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the sky, published when I was a few months old. That was a bit of a shock, as UFOs were a major part of the science fiction that obsessed me and informed my esoteric research. Jung's Flying Saucer book was included in Volume 10 of the collected works. Civilization in Transition, a title that has always struck me as both ominous and an almost comic example of Swiss understatement. The UFO subject seemed to haunt Jung near the end of his life. At the end of the book, it seemed like he couldn't let go of the subject. There was an afterword, followed by an epilogue, followed by a supplement. As I glanced through the supplement, I felt the air crackling with electricity again, and my eyes dilated in amazement. Jung had devoted his final supplement to analyzing mythological layers of meaning in the British science fiction novel The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. This was the novel that Village of the Damned was based on. It was like the dead Swiss guy had stepped out of the bookcase, like a holographic projection of a wizard bearing a torch, and he was looking over my shoulder and saying, "Yes, I was fascinated by that one too, and here's what I thought." From that moment forward, Jung became my mentor in unraveling the mystery of the Singularity archetype. Even then, however, I could see that Jung's supplement on the Midwich Cuckoos, with its strange placement after an afterword and an epilogue, seemed to have been the hastily thrown together afterthoughts of a restless mind obsessed with a subject on which there could be no closure. Jung was writing near the end of his life, and the flying saucer mythology he was studying was only in its infancy. Jung did not, by the way, assume that UFOs were merely hallucinations. He noted that they often reflected radar, and wondered aloud if they might not be physical exteriorizations of the collective unconscious. Jung's supplement spent 2 paragraphs summarizing the novel, and then just 2 paragraphs speculating about some of its implications and mythological motifs. Some of Jung's observations paralleled my own. I sensed, as Jung did, that unlike Arthur C. Clarke, Wyndham was viewing the singularity from the fearful vantage of the old form. Jung's brief study ends with a sentence, also the last sentence of the entire book, that seems to reflect the state of extreme, unfinished ambiguity that Jung was feeling about the whole subject. Quote, "Thus, the negative end of the story remains a matter for doubt." Unquote. What a strange sentence to end a book with. At the same moment that I recognized Jung as my mentor, and would soon discover that I needed to stand on his shoulders to get a clearer view of the mystery, I also sensed the unfinished place where he had left things. Amazingly, he had left off at exactly the place where I had begun. The Singularity archetype and the profound egocentric. Jung also provided me a hint that revealed an unexpected connection between the paper I had written on Dostoevsky while in college and my next project on the Singularity archetype. When I wrote the paper, I recognized that certain other writers, especially Kafka and Nietzsche, were also profound egocentrics. I also noticed that many of the mutants depicted in novels and movies inspired by the Singularity archetype were profound egocentrics as well. The connection, however, was not clear to me until I stumbled across an observation that Jung made about Nietzsche. In his collected works, Jung speculates that Nietzsche's inner torment was caused by the sensory basis of language being insufficient for him to express himself. This hint sparked a key speculative realization. The profound egocentric personality type was primarily the outcome of psyches who probably had the latent capacity for a new means of communication, and for whom language was not sufficient, but who were living in a social matrix where no such new means of communication was supported. In 1978, I described the realization this way. The profound egocentric's intense isolation seems to begin with earliest childhood. If we postulate that the profound egocentric is capable or partially capable of a new means of communication, while humanity as a whole is not, we could establish an excellent cause and effect relationship with the whole phenomenon. In his Symbols of Transformation, Jung discusses the sensual base of all language and the resultant limitations imposed on abstract thought. Jung suggests that the bitterness, loneliness, and eventual despair of Nietzsche was the result of the inadequacy for him of language. If there are individuals whose mental processes have developed enough to make our present form of communication inadequate, then perhaps a new one will evolve to parallel that development. And that was a quote from The product of my initial investigation, a philosophy honors paper entitled Archetypes of a New Evolution, which I finished late in the spring of 1978 when I was 20 years old, and it's available on the website and may be included as a supplemental section of the book, but that's yet to be determined. This paper, written when I was 20, was the first step in a new life phase for me that has continued into the present of a conscious awareness of the singularity archetype. I've been actively writing and speaking on the subject ever since. During the summer of 2010, 32 years after my initial paper in college, the time arrived to crystallize my findings and begin the book you are currently listening to.